Have you ever wondered what would happen if the case for the divinity of Jesus Christ wasn't a sermon but a closing argument in a courtroom? Well, today we're diving into a really fascinating take from a veteran trial attorney who does exactly that. He puts history's most famous case before a modern jury. So let's step into the courtroom.
The man behind this idea is Bill Roland, a trial attorney with over 4 decades of experience. And he's taking on what might be the biggest case of all time. He's acting as Jesus' defense attorney. He's inviting us to hear his closing argument. You know, that final persuasive pitch a lawyer makes right before the jury goes off to decide the verdict.
Now, Roland's goal here isn't to somehow retry the past. No. Instead, he's putting us in the jury box. He's asking us to weigh the evidence just as he presents it and to come to our own conclusion. So for the next few minutes, go ahead and consider yourself sworn in. Okay, so in any legal case, the first thing you have to establish is motive. Why did the religious leaders of that time want Jesus gone? Roland argues that if we're going to understand the case against his client, we first have to understand what was driving the people who were prosecuting him.
According to Roland, it really boils down to 2 huge threats. First, a threat to their authority. Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah, and that was a direct challenge to the power structure of the religious establishment. But it was also about money. When Jesus went into the temple and cleared out the money changers, he wasn't just making a spiritual statement, he was hitting them right where it hurts, disrupting a very profitable business. He was a threat to their power and their pocketbooks.
So, with the motive clear, let's look at the charges. According to Roland's argument, the official case that was brought before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate was basically a smokescreen. It was designed to hide the real issue the Jewish leaders had with Jesus. Think of it kind of like an iceberg. The part you see sticking out of the water, the part they showed to the Romans, was a list of political charges, things designed to get Pilate's attention, like subverting the nation, opposing taxes, claiming to be a king. But the real issue, the giant, massive part of the iceberg hidden under the water, was the religious charge of blasphemy.
So what exactly did blasphemy mean in this context? Well, under Jewish law, it was the act of doing things that only God was supposed to be able to do. Forgiving sins, performing these incredible miracles, and not giving God the proper credit. And from the high priest's point of view, that's exactly what Jesus was doing.
And this, right here, is the absolute pivot point of Roland's entire defense. He argues that if his client, Jesus, actually is God, well then the whole charge of blasphemy just completely falls apart. The very thing he's being accused of, doing the things of God, suddenly becomes a confirmation of who he really is. All right, so the central claim is now on the table. Jesus is God. That is a massive claim. So how on earth do you prove something that extraordinary to a jury? Well, you start presenting the evidence, piece by piece. And I love this analogy Roland uses. He says to think of all the evidence like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Any single piece, by itself, might not seem like much. It might not be all that convincing. But his job, as the lawyer, is to put all of those pieces together for the jury, so that by the very end, you can see the full, complete picture. He organizes his evidence into 3 main buckets. First, he'd call witnesses to the stand, people who saw the miracles with their own eyes. Second, he'd show how Jesus' life lined up with specific ancient prophecies. And finally, he'd present witness testimony to the most critical event of all, the resurrection. So the first piece of the puzzle is all about eyewitness testimony. Imagine you're in the courtroom. Roland would start calling a parade of witnesses to the stand. You'd hear from the servants at the wedding who saw water turn into wine, the man who was born blind and was given sight. And then, most dramatically, he'd call people who were literally raised from the dead, like Lazarus, or the people who saw it happen. Just imagine the power of that kind of first-hand testimony in court. Okay, the next puzzle piece is prophecy. Roland presents this like a form of ancient corroborating evidence. He points to these really specific predictions from the Old Testament, written hundreds of years earlier, and then shows how the events of Jesus' life match them with just stunning accuracy. Everything from his birthplace in Bethlehem to the exact price of his betrayal. But all of this evidence, the miracles, the prophecies, it's all building to what Roland considers the absolute linchpin of his entire case. The ultimate proof of his client's divinity, he says, rests on one single unbelievable event, the resurrection. So how do you prove something that sounds so impossible? Well, you bring in an extraordinary number of witnesses. Roland points to the Apostle Paul's account, which says that after his death, Jesus appeared to more than 500 people, all at one time. Now, in a court of law, 500 eyewitnesses to a single event, that is a staggering amount of testimony. And you know what? Those 500 weren't even the only ones. Roland's witness list is long and it's diverse. He'd call his closest followers, his own skeptical brother James, and even a former enemy, the Apostle Paul. In any courtroom, that is what you call a powerful, credible group of witnesses.
So, the puzzle pieces are all on the table. You've got the witness testimony to miracles, you've got the fulfillment of prophecy, and you have these extensive, detailed accounts of the resurrection. So now, Roland turns to the jury. He turns to us for the final verdict.
And Roland's last point is this. The jury today, right here, right now, actually has an advantage. We can see the entire puzzle fully assembled. We get to see the full scope of witness accounts and fulfilled prophecy. We have a more complete picture than anyone could have possibly had 2,000 years ago. And so Roland rests his case. He argues that Jesus is still on trial today, not in some Roman court, but in the court of public and personal opinion. And he leaves the final verdict up to each and every member of the jury, posing a question that shifts from a historical debate to a deeply personal decision. What will you do with him?